I am David, 32 years old. After 32 years of being the completely invisible son, the one who fixed every single problem while demanding absolutely nothing in return, I walked into my childhood home on a crisp Tuesday afternoon only to find that my parents had completely destroyed my 10-year-old son's sanctuary. While I was working two demanding jobs, sacrificing my sleep, and draining my salary just to build his college fund, my parents took it upon themselves to sell his rare book inheritance for a staggering $165,000. They did it for one sickening reason: to build a luxury home theater for my golden child brother, Julian, and his spoiled kids. When I confronted them amidst the rubble of my son's legacy, my mother looked me dead in the eye, adjusted her designer silk scarf and said, "They are just dusty papers, David. Your brother needs a proper place to entertain his real estate clients." But there was one massive, catastrophic detail they did not know. They were so blinded by their own vanity and greed that they forgot I was the legal archivist who controlled the historical tax exemption on their precious colonial estate. They also forgot that the inheritance they sold to a private buyer was bound by a strict federal cultural heritage trust. Now they are facing a devastating lawsuit, the total collapse of their carefully curated social standing, and they are begging for my mercy. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled their fake wealthy lives and brought their empire crashing down without ever raising my voice, hit that like button if you believe in justice. And let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Now, let's go back to the exact moment this nightmare began. You can smell a lie just as clearly as you can smell a cheap, rushed renovation. The chemical tang of fresh drywall, high-end latex paint, and industrial wood glue hit my lungs the very second I unlocked the heavy, solid oak front door of the Henderson Colonial Estate. This house had been in my family for 4 generations. It was a massive, sprawling property situated in one of the most affluent, gated neighborhoods in the state. For as long as I could remember, the grand foyer smelled of expensive lemon polish, beeswax, and the faint, comforting scent of peppermint tea and old parchment. It was a smell that commanded respect. It was the smell of old money and deep history. But on that specific Tuesday afternoon, the air felt thick, toxic, and entirely wrong. I was holding the hand of my 10-year-old son, Leo. We had just come from his elementary school after a parent-teacher conference where his teacher had praised his reading level and his quiet, thoughtful demeanor. He was wearing his favorite navy blue sweater, the one I had bought him at a discount rack at Walmart because every single extra dollar of my salary went straight into a high-yield savings account for his future. I had fought a brutal, soul-crushing custody battle during my divorce 5 years ago just to keep this boy safe. He was my entire world. And this house, specifically the grand library located in the isolated West Wing, was his absolute favorite place on earth. "Dad, it smells weird," Leo said, his voice barely above a whisper. He tightened his grip on my hand. His knuckles were slightly white. He was a highly perceptive child, always attuned to the slightest shifts in his environment. "I know, buddy. Let's go see what Grandma and Grandpa are up to. Maybe they are fixing a pipe," I replied, trying to keep my voice light and reassuring. We walked down the long, cavernous hallway. The sound of our shoes echoed sharply off the imported Italian marble flooring my parents had installed a decade ago. As we approached the West Wing, the ambient noise of the house shifted violently. The quiet hum of the central air conditioning was replaced by the aggressive whine of power drills, the heavy thud of hammers against studs, and loud, obnoxious country music echoing from a portable contractor's radio. The noise grew deafening with every step we took. I turned the corner into the West Wing corridor and froze completely. The library was gone. I do not mean the furniture was rearranged. I do not mean the room was being painted. I mean it was completely structurally gutted. The towering, custom-built mahogany bookshelves that my great-grandfather Arthur had commissioned in the 1950s, the shelves that had held centuries of literature, were violently ripped from the plaster walls. The custom climate control vents, installed to preserve the delicate parchment of the historical texts, were smashed and hanging from the ceiling by exposed wires. The beautiful, velvet-lined reading nook where Leo used to sit for hours, tracing the gold-leaf spines of first editions with his small fingers, was completely gone. In its place stood a massive, stepped wooden platform covered in fresh, yellow sawdust. Two burly contractors in heavy work boots were busy installing thick acoustic paneling over the historic, hand-painted wallpaper. My mother, Eleanor, was standing in the exact center of the destruction. She was holding a digital tablet, pointing aggressively at the far wall, and arguing loudly with the lead contractor about the placement of a 120-inch projection screen. She was wearing a silk blouse that cost more than my monthly car payment and perfectly tailored slacks. She looked completely in her element, entirely unbothered by the sheer devastation surrounding her. I did not scream. I did not throw my keys against the wall. I did not demand to know how she could be so incredibly cruel and soulless. That kind of dramatic, explosive reaction would have required an emotional investment I simply no longer possessed for the people who happened to share my DNA. Leo stopped walking. I felt his small hand go completely rigid in mine. He did not cry. He just stood there, staring at the empty space where his heritage, his sanctuary, and his sense of belonging used to be. He had spent years in that room with my great-grandfather Arthur. He had learned that some things in this world are precious, that they are meant to be preserved, protected, and cherished. In that single, defining, horrific moment, as he looked at the sawdust and the contractors, my 10-year-old son realized exactly which category he had been placed in by his own grandparents. He was disposable. He was collateral damage in their endless pursuit of status. "David, you are home early," my mother said, finally turning around and noticing us standing in the doorway. She did not look guilty. She did not look ashamed. She looked mildly annoyed at the interruption, as if we had walked in on her during an important business meeting. "What is this, Mom?" I asked. My voice was dangerously flat. It lacked any inflection whatsoever. "Oh, Julian and Chloe are expecting their second baby, and they really need a proper entertainment space for the kids and their friends. Julian's real estate business is booming, and he needs a place to host clients. We decided to convert this old, dusty room into a state-of-the-art home theater. Wait until you see the leather recliners we ordered. They have built-in massagers." "Where are the books?" I asked, cutting directly through her nauseating nonsense. She waved her hand dismissively in the air. "We sold them to a private collector. Julian really needed the funds for this renovation, and frankly, we needed to clear out the clutter. It is for the family, David. You should be happy for your brother. You know how hard he works." I looked at her. I really looked at her. I saw the pure, unfiltered, toxic entitlement radiating from her posture. I saw a woman who would gladly pave over my son's future just to give my brother a place to watch football on Sundays. I did not say another word. I turned around, kept my hand firmly and protectively wrapped around Leo's, and walked straight out of the house. I could hear my mother calling after me, telling me not to be so dramatic and overly sensitive, but the heavy oak door shutting firmly behind us cut her voice off completely. We got into my used sedan. The engine rumbled to life, the vibrations of the steering wheel matching the cold, steady rhythm of my racing heart. I sat there in the driveway for a long time, watching the contractors carry heavy boxes of expensive surround sound speakers into the house. I did not feel like a son anymore. I felt like an auditor. For 32 years, I had been the reliable son. I was the one who managed the estate's historical tax exemption portal. I was the one who ensured their precious colonial property kept its landmark status, saving them $35,000 in property taxes every single year. They saw it as my permanent duty to the family. I saw it as a subscription fee to a family I was finally realizing I had never actually been a part of. I reached into the back seat and pulled out my heavy laptop case. The time for being the quiet, helpful son was permanently over. The invisible chains were broken. It was time to go to war. To understand the absolute, freezing coldness in my chest at that moment in the driveway, you have to truly understand the invisible chains of the survivor. When you grow up in a house where love is treated like a limited, highly conditional resource, you learn to survive by becoming invisible. You learn early on that if you do not ask for anything, if you do not complain about the unfairness, and if you fix every single problem before it becomes an inconvenience for the people in charge, You might just get to stay at the dinner table. You might earn a fleeting nod of approval. Julian was the undisputed golden child. He was 3 years younger than me, but he took up absolutely all the oxygen in every room he entered. His needs, his wants, and his minor inconveniences were treated as national emergencies by my parents. When Julian wanted to play competitive lacrosse in high school, my parents bought him the most expensive, top-tier gear on the market and proudly attended every single game, cheering from the front row. When I won the statewide science fair the very same year, bringing home a massive trophy and a small scholarship, my father, Robert, patted me briefly on the shoulder, told me good job, and immediately went back to watching a golf tournament on television. It was a suffocating pattern that defined the entire trajectory of our lives. When Julian recklessly crashed his brand-new sports car 2 weeks after getting his license, my parents dipped heavily into their 401k retirement accounts without hesitation to buy him another one, claiming he needed a safe vehicle for his social life. When I graduated high school and was accepted into a prestigious university, they told me they could not afford to help. I took out crushing student loans, worked the grueling night shift at a 24-hour diner, and lived on ramen noodles to pay my tuition. They always told their friends at their exclusive HOA meetings that I was the independent one. They framed my struggle as a virtue. What they really meant was that I was the one they never had to worry about, because they knew I would always choose their comfort over my own basic needs. I built my career from the ground up as a legal archivist and historian. I deal with incredibly complex historical documents, property deeds, and high-value heritage trusts. It is a quiet, meticulous, and highly demanding profession. It requires immense patience and an absolute, unwavering dedication to facts and legal boundaries. My parents routinely mocked my job. They thought it was boring and unglamorous. Julian, on the other hand, became a real estate agent. It was a flashy, loud profession where he wore expensive tailored suits, posted constantly on social media, and drove a leased luxury SUV he could barely afford. My parents thought he was an absolute genius, a titan of industry in the making. When my marriage fell apart, the divorce was a brutal, drawn-out nightmare. My ex-wife, driven by spite, wanted full custody of Leo. I spent every single dime of my hard-earned savings on a ruthless lawyer to fight for my son. I skipped meals. I moved out of a comfortable house and into a tiny, cramped apartment with faulty plumbing just to afford the legal fees. During that entire 2-year hellish ordeal, my parents never once offered to help financially. In fact, they actively complained that my custody battle was causing them severe social stress at their elite country club. I won custody. Leo became my shadow, my quiet little partner in navigating life. We built a beautiful, peaceful existence together in our small apartment. But the only person in the entire extended family who truly saw me, who truly saw the incredible value in Leo, was my great-grandfather, Arthur. Arthur was 85 years old, a retired university professor of history with a mind as sharp and unforgiving as a surgical scalpel. He lived quietly in the east wing of the colonial estate. He despised the superficial, materialistic way my parents lived. He openly loathed how they coddled Julian. But most importantly, Arthur loved Leo with a fierce, protective devotion. Every single Sunday, after we endured a suffocating, unbearable family dinner where Julian bragged endlessly about his latest real estate commission and my mother fawned over him like he was royalty, Leo and I would quietly excuse ourselves and escape to Arthur's library. It was a truly magical room, a fortress of knowledge. The air was perfectly climate-controlled to preserve the massive, breathtaking collection of first-edition books Arthur had spent his entire adult life acquiring from all over the world. Some of those books were hundreds of years old. They had thick, heavy parchment pages, rough-cut edges, and leather bindings that smelled of deep history and quiet reverence. Arthur would sit in his high-backed, burgundy leather chair, slowly drinking hot peppermint tea, and teach Leo exactly how to handle the fragile books. He taught him to thoroughly wash and dry his hands before ever touching the pages. He taught him how to open the covers gently, supporting the weight of the book so the ancient spines would not crack. These are not just physical objects, Leo, Arthur told him one dark, rainy afternoon. I was sitting on the velvet sofa in the corner, quietly watching them. These are voices from the past. They are the intricate thoughts, the fears, and the massive dreams of people who are long gone from this earth. We are not just readers. We are the keepers of their stories. We protect them. Leo understood that completely. He felt the massive, important weight of that legacy settling onto his small shoulders. To a little boy who had gone through a messy divorce and often felt like an unwelcome burden to his flashy grandparents, that grand library was a profound promise. It was solid proof that he belonged to something much larger, something permanent, beautiful, and deeply meaningful. When Arthur's health began to rapidly fail a few years ago, he made a calculated legal decision that absolutely infuriated my parents. He bypassed them entirely in his estate planning and legally deeded his entire rare book collection directly to Leo. My parents were livid. They argued viciously that the collection was worth hundreds of thousands of dollars and should be liquidated to invest in the family's future, which was their thinly veiled code word for funding Julian's extravagant lifestyle and covering his mounting debts. But Arthur was ruthless and brilliant. He didn't just write a simple will that could be contested. He established a registered federal cultural heritage trust. He legally tied the books to the historical landmark status of the estate itself. He made me the sole executor and the official archivist in charge of maintaining the trust. My parents were allowed to continue living in the massive house rent-free, but their legal occupancy was strictly conditional on preserving the structural integrity of the estate and protecting the collection. They hated the arrangement, but they loved living in a multi-million-dollar mansion they did not have to pay a mortgage on. For years, I played my part perfectly. I filed the massive, complex annual compliance audits with the State Historical Registry. I managed the tedious tax exemption portal. I saved them exactly $35,000 every single year in property taxes through my meticulous administrative work. I did it because I wanted Leo to have uninterrupted access to that library. I foolishly thought my continued usefulness would buy us peace and a small slice of their respect. I was so incredibly wrong. Being easy to manage does not make you respected. It just makes you easier to overlook and infinitely easier to exploit. Sitting in my car outside the house, the memory of Arthur's strong voice echoed loudly in my head. We are the keepers of their stories. My parents had just taken the only thing my son truly valued, the only tangible connection he had to his great-grandfather, and sold it to buy luxury massage recliners and a giant projector screen. They assumed I would stay silent and accept it because I always had. They thought the heavy, rusted chains of my lifelong compliance would hold me firmly in place. They did not realize that when they targeted my son, they broke the very mechanism that kept me obedient. The deeply ingrained internal contract that bound me to their whims had been violently, permanently shredded. There was nothing left inside me but the cold, calculating, and highly dangerous mind of an archivist who knew exactly where all the legal bodies were buried. I drove Leo back to our apartment in complete silence. The ambient noise of the city traffic felt muffled, distant. I made him his favorite dinner, a simple bowl of macaroni and cheese with hot dogs cut into little pieces. We sat at the small kitchen table. He ate slowly, his eyes downcast. Afterward, we watched a cartoon together on the couch. He leaned his entire body weight against my side, his head resting heavily on my arm. He didn't say a single word about the library, about the sawdust, or about the missing books, but I could feel the immense, crushing tension radiating from his small shoulders. He was mourning a massive loss, and he was doing it silently, just like I had been taught to do my entire life. Once he was deeply asleep in his bed, I walked out to my small desk in the living room and opened my laptop. I needed cold, hard facts. Anger is a messy, chaotic emotion. It makes you reckless and prone to making mistakes. I needed to be surgically precise. I opened the family group chat on my phone. The notifications had been muted for hours. When I scrolled through the missed messages, the sheer audacity and cruelty of what I read made the blood in my veins run completely cold. Julian had sent a picture of a massive, 120-inch metal screen frame being mounted directly onto the wall where the poetry section used to be. The caption read, "Movie nights are going to be absolutely epic. Thanks Mom and Dad for the early Christmas present. You guys are the best. My father, Robert, replied a few minutes later. Only the best for our grandkids. Wait until the imported leather seating arrives next week. It's going to be better than the VIP section at the cinema. I stared at the screen. My jaw clenched so tight my teeth ached. I typed a single, direct message into the chat. How much did you sell Leo's books for? I watched the screen. The typing bubbles appeared next to Julian's name, then disappeared. They appeared next to my father's name, then vanished. Finally, my mother replied with a long paragraph. David, please don't start drama. We found a very respectable private buyer in the city, Mr. Sterling. He paid $165,000 for the entire lot. It was a more than fair price for old paper. Those books were just gathering dust and taking up incredibly valuable real estate in the house. Julian really needed the space for his business, and the family needed the upgrade. Leo can read digital books on his iPad like a normal modern child. Stop living in the past. $165,000. They had liquidated my son's inheritance, a priceless collection carefully curated over decades by my great-grandfather, for a fraction of its true auction value, just to get quick, untraceable cash for a home renovation. They did not even have the decency to consult me as the executor of the trust. They just packed up the history of our family in cardboard boxes and shipped it off to a millionaire. The power shift inside my mind felt clinical, absolute, and terrifyingly calm. I did not feel the urge to call her and argue. I did not type out a long, emotional paragraph about how deeply hurt and betrayed I was. You do not negotiate with people who steal from children. You simply remove their access to your resources and watch them suffocate. I logged into the state's historical registry and property tax portal. For the past 10 years, I had been the sole authorized liaison between our family estate and the state government's preservation department. My parents firmly believed the massive property tax break they received was their inherent birthright. They loved to brag endlessly at their elite HOA meetings and Thanksgiving dinners about living in a certified historical landmark. It gave them an air of old-world aristocracy. But they conveniently, arrogantly forgot that the status was strictly contingent on my professional, highly detailed annual compliance audit. To maintain the exemption, the property had to remain structurally unaltered, and the protected assets, specifically the library and the collection within it, had to remain on site, in the exact climate-controlled environment specified by the trust. I did not have to hack into any secure systems. I did not have to bend any ethical rules. I simply had to do my job and report the absolute truth. I pulled up the compliance form for the current fiscal year. I navigated through the dense legal jargon to the section regarding the interior structural integrity of the West Wing. Status. I clicked the drop-down menu and changed it from compliant to severely compromised. Notes. I typed with steady, deliberate, heavy strokes on the keyboard. The registered historical library has been illegally gutted. Protected architectural features, including the original 1950s mahogany shelving, have been permanently destroyed to install modern entertainment equipment. Furthermore, the registered cultural assets, the Arthur Rare Book Collection, have been removed from the premises and sold to an unauthorized private party without the knowledge or legal consent of the trust executor. I attached the photo Julian had so proudly posted in the group chat, showing the blatant destruction of the room. I scrolled to the bottom of the page. I read the bold legal disclaimer stating that filing this report of noncompliance would result in the immediate, non-negotiable revocation of the property's historical landmark status, thereby triggering a retroactive, full-rate property tax assessment for the current year. I clicked Submit. The screen loaded for an agonizing second, then displayed a bright green checkmark. Notice of non-compliance filed successfully. With that single quiet click of my mouse, I had just added a massive $35,000 tax bill to my parents' yearly expenses. They would receive the official notice in the mail in a matter of days. But I was not done. I was not even close to being done. I opened my banking app on my phone. Just last month, my mother had relentlessly, aggressively pressured me into paying the $12,000 catering deposit for Julian's upcoming theater reveal party. She claimed her cash flow was temporarily tied up in the renovation costs and called it my mandatory contribution to the family's happiness and Julian's success. I had paid it out of my emergency savings, the way I always did, thinking it would keep the peace and stop her endless guilt-tripping phone calls. My compassion had been a luxury they had overdrafted for decades, and the account was finally permanently empty. I initiated a hard stop payment on the $12,000 catering deposit. When the prompt asked for a reason, I cited fraud and unauthorized emotional pressure. The bank's automated system processed the request immediately. I watched the confirmation screen glow brightly in the dark living room. Transaction canceled. Funds returned to account. I didn't hesitate. I didn't ask myself if Julian would be embarrassed when the luxury caterers refused to show up, or if my mother would have a spectacular public meltdown. This was no longer a toxic family dynamic. It was a balance sheet, and they were about to realize they were deeply, irreversibly in the red. I closed the laptop, the satisfying click echoing in the quiet room. I walked into Leo's bedroom. He was sleeping soundly, clutching a small, worn paperback book tightly to his chest. I gently pulled the blanket up over his shoulders and kissed his forehead. "I've got you, buddy," I whispered to the dark room. "I am going to get it all back. Every single page." The fallout from my silence began the very next morning. My phone started vibrating intensely on the kitchen counter at exactly 8:15 a.m. It was my mother. I watched the screen light up with her contact photo, a posed, overly filtered picture of her at a charity gala. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. It stopped for exactly 3 seconds, then immediately started buzzing again. This time, the caller ID showed my Aunt Beatrice. Beatrice was my mother's older sister. She was a woman who specialized in pretending to care deeply while secretly gathering personal gossip to use as high-grade ammunition later. She was the family's unofficial, highly toxic mediator. I poured myself a large cup of black coffee, leaned comfortably against the kitchen counter, and finally answered the call. "David, sweetie." Beatrice's voice oozed through the speaker, thick with fake, sugary sympathy. "I heard what happened with the old books yesterday. Your mother called me in tears. She is just terribly stressed about the renovation and the upcoming party. You know how anxious she gets when things are disorganized. But you shouldn't be so angry and storm out like a teenager. Family is family, David. Is that right, Beatrice?" I took a slow, deliberate sip of my hot coffee. "Well, yes, of course. And Julian is doing so incredibly well in real estate right now. He really needs a proper place to host his high-end clients. The books were just taking up valuable space, collecting mold. Your mother says you won't answer her calls this morning. You really should be the bigger person and apologize for storming out yesterday. It severely upset her blood pressure." I smiled. It was a cold, razor-sharp, humorless smile. Beatrice was the ultimate manipulator, playing both sides of the fence. I knew for an absolute fact she was sitting in her pristine kitchen, probably on a three-way call with my mother listening in, trying to bait me into an emotional outburst they could use to paint me as the unstable one. "Beatrice," I said, my voice eerily calm, "tell my mother I have absolutely nothing to say to her, and tell Julian I hope he truly enjoys looking at his new screen, because it's going to be the most expensive movie he ever watches." I hung up the phone before she could formulate a response and immediately blocked her number, followed by my mother's, my father's, and Julian's. I didn't have the time or the patience for their petty high school manipulation games. I had a massive federal investigation to launch. I opened Instagram. Julian's profile was completely public. Naturally. He had just posted a new reel an hour ago. There he was, standing proudly in the middle of the gutted, destroyed library. He was wearing a tight, designer polo shirt, pointing excitedly at the massive screen frame anchored to the wall. He had applied a ridiculous sparkling filter that made the construction dust floating in the air look like magical falling glitter. Upbeat, obnoxious pop music blared over the video. The caption read, "Clearing out the old dust to make room for the stars. The new Henderson Home Theater is going to be absolutely legendary. Can't wait for the reveal party on Saturday. Hashtag luxury living, hashtag real estate life, hashtag blessed, hashtag family first. He was practically dancing on the grave of his nephew's inheritance. They were not just unapologetic. They were wildly triumphant. They viewed the theft of Leo's future as a simple, necessary reallocation of family assets. To them, Julian was the main character of the universe, and Leo and I were just background NPCs meant to facilitate his ultimate comfort. I took a high-resolution screenshot of the video and the caption. It was more undeniable evidence for the legal file. At 9 a.m. sharp, I picked up the phone and dialed Marcus's direct office line. Marcus was a former colleague of mine, now serving as the lead investigator and legal counsel for the State University's Rare Books and Cultural Heritage Department. He was a man who took the preservation of history dead seriously. When he answered, his voice was crisp, deep, and highly professional. "David, good to hear from you. Do you have those archival files on the 19th century deeds I asked about last month?" "I do, Marcus. I'll email them over. But I'm actually calling about something else entirely. Something much more serious. I need to report a massive, unauthorized irregularity involving the Arthur Heritage Trust." There was a long, heavy pause on the line. The tone of the conversation instantly shifted from casual collegial banter to strictly legal business. "The first editions? The ones legally deeded to your son, Leo?" "Yes. The entire collection was unlawfully removed from the climate-controlled sanctuary yesterday afternoon and sold to a private buyer by the current occupants of the estate." I heard a sharp intake of breath over the receiver. "David, you know the exact legal standing of that specific trust. Your great-grandfather locked that down tight. If the collection was moved off the premises without authorization—" "I know," I interrupted, my voice devoid of emotion. "They sold it to a Mr. Sterling in the city for $165,000 to fund a luxury home renovation. They completely destroyed the library architecture. I have already filed a formal notice of non-compliance with the State Historical Registry this morning." Marcus cursed under his breath, a rare break in his professionalism. "David, that is a federal heritage felony. The university is legally bound as the overseer to protect the integrity of that trust. If they sold those assets, they didn't just break a family promise. They flagrantly violated state and federal preservation laws. I need you to initiate a formal heritage audit," I said, my voice steady as stone. "Today. Right now. I'll have Evan in the records department pull the original trust agreement immediately. We will issue the formal inquiry notices by the end of the business day. David, you understand exactly what this means for your parents, right? If they cannot recover those books intact, the financial and legal penalties are catastrophic. They could lose the house." "I understand perfectly, Marcus. Do it." I hung up the phone. For the first time in 32 years, I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of clarity. At noon, I drafted a single, formal email. I bypassed the blocked phone numbers and sent it directly to their professional email addresses. I didn't use emotional language. I used the cold, terrifying language of a legal executioner. To all parties residing at the Henderson estate, please be advised that I have officially initiated a full inventory and legal audit of the Arthur Heritage Trust in conjunction with the State University Legal Department. The unauthorized liquidation of protected cultural assets is a direct violation of federal law. Any missing assets must be fully accounted for and returned to the premises within 48 hours to avoid immediate criminal prosecution and civil forfeiture. I hit send. I sat back in my chair, staring at my laptop screen. I had set up red receipts on the email. Within seconds, the notifications popped up. Read by Robert Henderson. Read by Eleanor Henderson. Read by Julian Henderson. I could perfectly picture the absolute panic setting in. The realization was finally hitting them that their endless free ride had just hit a massive brick wall, and the wall was made of ironclad legal documents. They had spent years assuming my talent for order, rules, and law was just a boring convenience for them to exploit. They were about to learn that in the world of professional archiving, the numbers never lie, and the paper trail always leads directly back to the truth. The storm had officially made landfall. and I was standing perfectly still in the dead center of the eye, waiting patiently to watch their arrogant kingdom burn to ash. Saturday evening arrived with a bitter, biting chill in the air, the kind of deep cold that sinks directly into your bones and makes the world feel sharp and unforgiving. I parked my used, 10-year-old sedan 3 blocks away from the Henderson Colonial Estate. I did not want my completely average car anywhere near their grand driveway. The visual contrast was going to be entirely too stark, and frankly, I did not want their hired valet drivers touching my property. As my great-grandfather Arthur and I walked up the long, sweeping, tree-lined driveway, the sheer, unimaginable scale of my parents' delusion was proudly on full display. The driveway looked like a high-end luxury showroom for the most elite, untouchable wealth in the entire state. My parents had invited absolutely everyone they deemed important to this ridiculous theater reveal party. They desperately wanted to show off the freshly constructed fruits of their stolen inheritance. I walked slowly, matching Arthur's deliberate pace as he leaned heavily on his silver-tipped wooden cane. We passed a gleaming, midnight black Rolls-Royce parked arrogantly right next to the front steps. Just behind it was a bright, aggressively yellow Lamborghini, sitting low to the ground like a predatory insect. A cherry-red Ferrari was idling near the entrance, its engine purring loudly while a valet rushed to open the door for a local real estate developer. And finally, a pristine white Porsche took up the premium space near the manicured garden hedges. These were not our family's cars. These vehicles belonged to the commercial real estate tycoons, the local politicians, the banking executives, and the country club elite that my parents had spent their entire adult lives desperately trying to impress. My parents were frantically trying to project an impenetrable image of generational wealth and untouchable success, all funded by the stolen future of a 10-year-old boy. "Just look at this absolute circus, David," Arthur said. His voice was raspy, aged by time, but entirely steady and vibrating with a quiet, dangerous rage. He gripped the handle of his cane so tightly his knuckles turned white. "They have actually invited the entire town to watch them celebrate a federal crime. The absolute arrogance of it is astounding." "They think they won, Grandpa," I replied, keeping my voice low as we approached the massive, solid oak double doors of the estate. "They truly believe they successfully traded old paper for modern power. They think they outsmarted us. Let them enjoy the grand illusion for just a few more minutes. The fall is going to break every single bone in their egos." We walked through the heavy front doors and stepped into the grand foyer. The space was absolutely packed shoulder to shoulder with people holding delicate crystal champagne flutes. A hired, 4-piece string quartet was situated in the corner, aggressively playing classical music that echoed off the imported Italian marble floors. Waiters in crisp, perfectly ironed white shirts and black silk vests were circling the crowded room, carrying silver trays loaded with expensive, bite-sized hors d'oeuvres, roasted duck, caviar on tiny crackers, and truffle-infused pastries. The air in the house was a suffocating, overwhelming mixture of expensive designer perfumes, rich food, and the faint, lingering, undeniable chemical odor of the fresh latex paint bleeding out from the newly renovated West Wing. My mother, Eleanor, intercepted us almost immediately. She possessed a terrifying radar for anything that could potentially disrupt her carefully curated social events. She was wearing a floor-length, custom-tailored emerald silk gown that hugged her frame perfectly and likely cost more than a year of my son's private school tuition. She had clearly spent the entire afternoon at a high-end salon. Her hair was flawless, and she was dripping in heavy diamond jewelry. When she saw Arthur and me standing in the doorway, her practiced, camera-ready smile tightened fractionally, revealing a brief flash of genuine panic in her eyes. But she quickly masked it, pasting on a theatrical expression of utter delight for the immediate benefit of the wealthy guests standing nearby. "Arthur, David, you actually came," she declared, her voice dripping with artificial, sugary sweetness. She stepped forward and leaned in close to me, dropping her voice to a harsh, venomous whisper so only I could hear her over the string quartet. "I am so glad you finally decided to act like a mature adult and support your brother's massive career promotion. Do not even think about causing a scene tonight, David." Mayor Thomas is standing right over there, and Julian is about to close a massive, multi-million-dollar commercial real estate deal with him. Do not ruin this for our family. I looked her directly in the eyes. I did not offer a polite smile. I did not blink. I just stared at the woman who had happily sold her grandson's legacy for a room full of leather chairs. I would not miss this night for the world, Mother, I said, my voice completely devoid of any human warmth. I am here to see exactly what the Henderson legacy has become. She shot me a highly nervous, calculating look, her eyes darting back and forth as if trying to read my mind. But her vanity quickly took over, and she turned her absolute attention back to a wealthy woman wearing a diamond necklace the size of a small chandelier. Arthur and I silently moved past her, navigating our way through the sea of expensive suits and evening gowns, making a direct path toward the West Wing. The large crowd was naturally migrating toward the newly renovated space, drawn in by the promise of the grand reveal. Julian was standing confidently at the wide entrance of the new home theater, aggressively shaking hands, laughing loudly, and eagerly accepting endless compliments from older, wealthier men. He was wearing a custom-tailored, midnight blue tuxedo that fit him like a glove. His wife, Chloe, was standing dutifully right next to him. She was holding her pregnant belly, smiling perfectly for the glowing screens of the local socialites taking photos for their Instagram stories. Julian looked exactly like a man who firmly believed he owned the entire world and everyone living in it. I stepped up and looked into the theater room. It was a staggering masterpiece of absolute, sickening indulgence. The towering, historic mahogany shelves that had stood in that room for nearly a century were completely gone, erased from existence. They were replaced by thick, padded acoustic walls heavily covered in dark, suffocating velvet. There were 3 elevated rows of imported, oversized premium leather recliners. Each chair featured built-in, glowing LED lighting, refrigerated cup holders, and electronic massage functions. At the very front of the room, a massive, wall-to-wall projector screen dominated the space, currently displaying a high-definition, looping video of exploding fireworks. It was sterile. It was utterly soulless. It was a massive, expensive monument to their own fragile vanity, funded entirely by a stolen college fund and a desecrated cultural heritage. My father, Robert, stepped confidently up to the front of the room, standing directly beneath the glowing screen. He held a glass of vintage champagne in one hand and tapped it lightly with a heavy silver spoon. The sharp, high-pitched ringing sound immediately cut through the loud chatter of the crowd. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing. The room fell into an expectant, reverent silence as all eyes turned to the patriarch of the Henderson family. Friends, beloved family, esteemed colleagues, and the Honorable Mayor Thomas. Robert began, his voice booming with a sickening, unearned, arrogant authority. Thank you all for joining us tonight in our beautiful, historical colonial home. When my grandfather first built this massive estate, he envisioned a place where the family could gather, grow, and celebrate massive success. Tonight, we officially unveil the absolute newest addition to that great legacy. He gestured broadly and dramatically toward the massive, glowing screen and the rows of luxury leather seating. This new entertainment wing represents our deep, unwavering commitment to the next generation of our family. It is a highly modern space dedicated to my incredible son Julian, his beautiful, growing family, and the absolutely incredible, groundbreaking strides he is making in the commercial real estate sector. We firmly believe in honoring the past by actively building a brighter, more entertaining, and highly successful future. Please, raise your glasses to family, to massive success, and to the enduring Henderson legacy. The crowd erupted into polite, enthusiastic applause. Julian beamed with absolute pride, wrapping his arm tightly around Chloe's waist. My mother dabbed gracefully at a fake, performative tear in the corner of her eye. They were standing at the absolute, undeniable peak of their desperate social climb, basking deeply in the warm glow of a high society status they had literally stolen from my 10-year-old son. I looked down at Arthur standing beside me. He did not have a crystal glass to raise. He simply leaned his entire body weight onto his wooden cane. His sharp, intelligent eyes locked dead on Robert. The polite applause in the room slowly began to die down. The wealthy guests prepared to take their first sip of the expensive vintage champagne. The legal trap was perfectly set. It was finally time to close the steel jaws. Arthur took one single, deliberate step forward. The sharp, incredibly heavy click of his silver-tipped cane striking forcefully against the expensive, newly installed slate flooring echoed violently through the suddenly quiet room. He took another step, then another. There is a very specific, undeniable kind of gravity that comes with true, unapologetic authority, and Arthur possessed absolutely all of it. The crowd of wealthy elites naturally parted for him, stepping aside as if reacting to an invisible, magnetic force. He stopped directly in the center of the room, standing completely face-to-face with Robert. Robert's confident, arrogant smile instantly froze on his face, turning into a rigid, unnatural grimace. The expensive glass of champagne in his hand began to tremble slightly, the golden liquid sloshing against the crystal rim. "Well, Robert," Arthur said. His voice was not loud. He did not shout, but it carried a razor-sharp, terrifying edge that effortlessly cut right through the warm, celebratory atmosphere of the room. "You have certainly been remarkably busy destroying the historical integrity of my house." A nervous, highly uncomfortable murmur rippled rapidly through the tight crowd of VIP guests. Mayor Thomas shifted very uncomfortably in his expensive Italian leather shoes, glancing toward the exit. My mother, Eleanor, stepped forward incredibly quickly, her face flushed with sudden, hot panic. "Arthur, please," Eleanor hissed, reaching out and desperately trying to grab his arm to pull him away from the center of attention. "This is a joyous celebration for your grandson. Let us talk about this private family matter in the kitchen." Arthur did not even bother to look at her. He simply raised his free hand in a sharp, dismissive gesture, and she physically recoiled from the unspoken threat of it, stumbling back into a leather chair. Arthur turned his piercing, unforgiving gaze entirely back to my father. "I heard you sold the collection, Robert," Arthur stated clearly for the entire room to hear. It was not a question. It was a formal, devastating legal indictment. "I heard you took the sacred heritage of this family, the specific historical legacy I legally and intentionally deeded exclusively to my great-grandson, and you completely liquidated it behind my back to buy reclining massage chairs and a television screen." "Dad, be reasonable, it was just old paper," Robert managed to stammer, his voice suddenly thin, weak, and cracking under the immense, crushing pressure of 100 pairs of eyes. He looked around desperately at the wealthy guests, desperately trying to maintain his carefully constructed facade of control. "We absolutely needed to modernize the property. It was a highly sound, logical financial decision for the upkeep of the estate." Arthur's eyes grew completely, terrifyingly cold. He slowly swept his gaze over the large crowd of socialites, investors, politicians, and business partners. When he spoke again, he addressed the entire room like a federal Supreme Court judge delivering a final, inescapable, life-altering verdict. "You all stand here tonight, drinking expensive champagne, deeply admiring the supposed wealth and incredible status of the Henderson family," Arthur announced, his voice gaining immense strength and booming volume. "But you are standing right now in a fragile house of cards built entirely by common thieves. This rare book collection, and this entire massive colonial estate, were never theirs to alter, sell, or manage. They are held in a highly restrictive, federally registered cultural heritage trust." The silence that immediately followed that statement was absolute. It was so incredibly sharp, heavy, and profound that it actually felt like physical glass breaking inside the room. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. "For 31 long years," Arthur continued, his voice echoing fiercely off the dark velvet walls, "you completely mistook your temporary status as mere trustees for an actual, legal property deed. You were granted a highly conditional life estate, Robert. You had a strict legal right to occupy these halls only as long as you fiercely, aggressively guarded this historical legacy. By ripping out the protected architectural history of this room and selling those legally protected cultural assets to an unauthorized private buyer in the city, you triggered the absolute, automatic dissolution of your tenancy. My father's face instantly drained of all human color. He turned a sickly shade of gray, looking exactly like a man who had just been shoved violently out of an airplane without a parachute. Suddenly realizing the ground was rushing up to meet him, Julian completely dropped his arm from Chloe's waist, his mouth hanging wide open in utter, uncomprehending shock. "You are not the owners of this estate, Robert," Arthur said, delivering the final, fatal, crushing blow with absolute precision. "You were merely the occupants. And as of yesterday afternoon, when my appointed archivist filed the official notice of noncompliance with the state government, you became illegal trespassers who miserably failed the ironclad terms of the trust. You just committed a massive federal heritage felony in order to build a movie theater." The empty, pathetic wallet of their lives was finally, brutally revealed to the public. My parents were not the elite. They were not the untouchable, generational aristocrats they pretended so desperately to be. They were just careless, greedy caretakers who had foolishly burned the priceless antique furniture to keep themselves warm for one single night, and the roaring fire had finally reached the structural walls of their lives, burning everything to the ground. The grand illusion of their immense wealth evaporated into thin air right before my eyes. Every single person in that crowded room who drove a Lamborghini, a Rolls-Royce, or a Ferrari suddenly, horrifyingly realized they were actively attending a highly publicized party hosted by federal criminals who were about to lose absolutely everything they claimed to own. I stood quietly in the back of the room, my arms crossed comfortably over my chest. I watched the absolute, unadulterated terror violently wash over my mother's highly Botoxed face. I did not feel a single, fleeting ounce of pity for her. I did not feel a microscopic shred of regret for what I had set in motion. The massive emotional account of my empathy had been permanently, legally closed, its heavy iron doors barred and bolted tightly against any further emotional exploitation. Every single dollar they had happily poured into this tacky theater wing was now a dollar that the state university and the federal government would aggressively, relentlessly demand back in severe, crushing restitution. I wanted to be standing right here in the front row when the lights went out permanently on their carefully constructed lie. And the lights were about to be cut right now. The official, legal notice to vacate the premises did not come with a dramatic, screaming reality television confrontation or a violent physical altercation. It was delivered with the absolute, terrifying, clinical efficiency of the American legal system. From the very back of the crowded room, right near the entrance of the theater wing, lawyer Sarah stepped forward. She was the lead legal counsel for the state university's Cultural Heritage Department, and she did not look like she was attending a joyous celebration. She was dressed in a sharp, dark gray business suit, her face completely unreadable. She looked exactly like a highly trained executioner holding a lethal injection needle. She was flanked tightly by Officer Jenkins, a stern, heavily built uniformed officer from the State Preservation Task Force. Sarah carried a thick, heavy manila folder bursting with official legal documents bearing state seals. The crowd of wealthy elites physically parted rapidly to let them through. Nobody in that room, especially the politicians, wanted to be standing anywhere near the massive blast radius of a federal heritage lawsuit. "Robert and Eleanor Henderson," Sarah said clearly, her voice completely devoid of any warmth, hesitation, or human sympathy. She stopped directly next to Arthur and held out the thick stack of legal papers. "I am officially serving you with a formal, state-mandated notice of eviction and a direct federal mandate for immediate asset recovery." My mother physically stepped back, her high heels catching on the carpet. She bumped hard into a luxury leather recliner, treating the stack of papers like they were heavily coated in deadly poison. Robert just stared completely blankly at the documents, entirely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the disaster unfolding in front of his wealthy peers. "You have exactly 60 days to completely vacate these premises," Sarah continued, reading loudly and clearly from the top sheet of the legal filing. "Furthermore, you are legally, unconditionally mandated to restore the Arthur Rare Book Collection to the Heritage Trust in its absolute entirety. If you fail to rapidly recover the assets intact from the private buyer, you will be held personally and criminally liable for the full market auction value of $165,000, plus an additional $50,000 in immediate, non-negotiable punitive damages and severe legal penalties for the blatant breach of a federal cultural heritage trust. Robert's fingers finally went completely numb. The expensive, vintage champagne glass slipped entirely from his grasp. It fell in slow motion, shattering violently against the hard slate floor, sending sharp crystal shards and expensive golden alcohol splashing directly onto his highly polished leather shoes. He looked around desperately at the elite, untouchable social circle he had spent decades meticulously cultivating using a rented, fake status. He looked for a friendly face, someone to defend him. Instead, he saw Mayor Thomas quietly setting his untouched drink heavily on a side table and rapidly slipping out the side door into the garden without saying a single word of goodbye. The massive, protective walls of his fake kingdom were already turning into heavy, choking ash right in front of him. The Grand Theater reveal party did not end with a celebratory toast or a round of applause. It ended with a rapid, chaotic, highly embarrassing mass exodus. Laughter died violently mid-sentence. Casual conversations evaporated instantly as people who had been so incredibly eager to enjoy the free luxury moments before suddenly, conveniently remembered they had highly urgent places to be. They saw the federal heritage felony investigation for exactly what it undeniably was. A terminal, highly contagious, incurable diagnosis for the family's public reputation. I watched the elite guests actively, intentionally avoid making any eye contact whatsoever with Eleanor as they rushed aggressively toward the coat check in the foyer. Their total, suffocating silence was a brutal, incredibly harsh confirmation of the ultimate truth. In their shallow, materialistic world, you are only as valuable as the liquid assets you can actually prove you own outright. The long driveway emptied out in absolute record time, the loud roar of luxury Lamborghini and Rolls-Royce engines fading rapidly into the cold, unforgiving night air. Julian's collapse was the most public, the most pathetic, and the most humiliating of all. As the massive news of the heritage theft broke across the room, the fake, highly curated influencer brand he had spent years building on social media began to completely shred in real time. Chloe, his beautiful, pregnant wife, stood frozen in the corner of the theater. She was staring wide-eyed at the massive eviction notice securely in Sarah's hands. Chloe came from a genuinely wealthy, highly respected old money family, and she had married Julian firmly believing he was the sole, legitimate heir to a massive real estate fortune and a historical estate. She walked slowly over to Julian. She did not yell. She did not cry. She just looked at him with profound, absolute, unadulterated disgust. "You looked me in the eyes and told me you owned this house," Chloe said, her voice shaking violently with pure, white-hot rage. "You told me we were moving in here next year to raise our children in luxury. You are completely, utterly broke, Julian. You are facing a massive federal lawsuit, and you lied to my face." "Chloe, baby, wait. Please, I can explain everything. We will just hire a great lawyer. It's a misunderstanding," Julian stammered pathetically, reaching out with a trembling hand to grab hers. She slapped his hand away so violently the sound echoed in the empty room. She reached aggressively into her designer purse, pulled out her heavy car keys, and looked directly at my mother with pure hatred. "I am filing for a vicious, total divorce on Monday morning at 8 a.m., and I am getting full, uncompromising custody of the kids. Have fun rotting in federal court, you absolute frauds." She turned sharply on her expensive heel and walked rapidly out of the house, leaving Julian standing completely alone, entirely broken, in the middle of his ruined, tacky theater. He pulled out his phone with shaking hands, desperately opening his Instagram app. The followers who had heavily, aggressively praised his construction video earlier that day were now rapidly flooding his comments section with words like thief, fraud, scammer, and criminal. Someone had already leaked the news of the police presence at the house. His entire real estate career was a massive monument to his own towering vanity, and it was crumbling rapidly, irreversibly under the massive weight of a single, undeniable truth. He had foolishly tried to build a legacy on a foundation of theft, and the ground had just swallowed him whole. 60 days felt like a single, incredibly satisfying heartbeat. My parents were aggressively, legally forced to immediately sell their remaining luxury cars, rapidly cancel their elite country club memberships, and pawn all of my mother's expensive jewelry just to pay back Mr. Sterling and desperately try to cover the massive, crushing legal fines imposed by the state. They packed their remaining clothes into cheap, brown cardboard boxes and moved into a small, cramped, heavily outdated two-bedroom apartment on the loud, heavily polluted industrial outskirts of the city. It was a miserable place that did not have a massive theater wing, it did not have a heated swimming pool, and it certainly did not have a grand history they could hide behind to make themselves feel superior. They were finally, completely forced to live exactly the way they had forced me to live for years. The grand colonial estate felt fundamentally, beautifully different the very day Leo, Arthur, and I finally moved our boxes in through the front doors. The silence in the massive, high-ceilinged hallways was not heavy, oppressive, or filled with unspoken tension anymore. It was incredibly light, airy, and deeply peaceful, exactly like a massive house that had finally finished holding its breath after enduring a long, terrifying nightmare. There were no more loud, obnoxious construction noises echoing through the walls. There was no more chemical, toxic tang of fresh latex paint burning our lungs. There was absolutely no performative, fake laughter from shallow people who treated our deep, sacred family heritage like a highly disposable financial asset. We spent the entire, exhausting first week relentlessly, aggressively dismantling what remained of that sickening theater wing. The heavy, dark acoustic velvet drapes were violently stripped from the historic walls and thrown mercilessly into a massive rented dumpster sitting in the driveway. The oversized, tacky metal projector screen was unbolted from the original plaster and hauled away as scrap metal. We hired a team of highly specialized, professional historical carpenters to come in and meticulously, lovingly recreate the grand mahogany shelves my great-grandfather had commissioned decades ago, matching the original 1950s blueprints perfectly. The absolute best, most triumphant moment came on a quiet, rainy Thursday afternoon. Mr. Sterling, the wealthy private collector who had originally bought the books from my parents, actually proved to be an incredibly honorable man. When Marcus the lawyer contacted him directly and explained the severe criminal nature of the sale and the broken trust, Mr. Sterling was utterly horrified. He was a true historian at heart. He immediately agreed to return the collection in full, without demanding a lengthy legal battle, to completely avoid being implicated in a messy federal lawsuit. When the heavy, secure wooden crates containing the incredibly rare first edition books were finally returned to the estate and carefully, meticulously unpacked by Leo and Arthur, the library's true, ancient soul rapidly returned to the room. It was that perfect, unmistakable, deeply comforting scent of old parchment, rich wood polish, and Arthur's hot peppermint tea. I sat at my solid, heavy oak desk right in the heart of the beautifully restored library. I opened my phone one last time to check my messages before I deleted the old contacts forever. The family group chat was a stagnant, highly toxic pool of unread demands, frantic, desperate apologies, and severe, manipulative guilt-tripping messages sent furiously from the cramped, miserable apartment on the outskirts of town. My mother had sent over 20 long, rambling text messages begging for financial help, claiming she couldn't afford her groceries. Beatrice had left 3 long, crying voicemails telling me I was a monster for tearing the family apart over some old books. Julian had sent an email begging me to give him a loan to pay for his incredibly expensive divorce lawyer. For 32 long years, I had been the highly useful, perfectly silent son. I was the one who handled the complicated logistics, paid the difficult bills, and managed the tedious legal paperwork while being treated entirely like a disposable, completely irrelevant supporting character in my own life story. I was the one they aggressively called to effortlessly save them thousands in taxes, but I was the very first one they happily sold out for a row of massage chairs. I did not type a final, dramatic word in response. I did not demand a long, tearful apology they were completely, fundamentally incapable of giving. You cannot force deeply toxic, narcissistic people to suddenly develop a conscience or a sense of empathy. I simply hit the delete button on the conversation thread. Then, I went deeply into my phone settings and permanently, unconditionally blocked every single one of their numbers, their emails, and their social media accounts. For the first time in my entire adult life, there was absolutely no noise. There was no manipulation. There was no subtle cruelty. There was just absolute, unadulterated peace. I looked over at my son, Leo. He was curled up comfortably in a restored, oversized leather armchair near the large bay window, the soft afternoon sun catching the dust motes floating in the air around him. He had a heavy, leather-bound volume resting safely in his lap. He was turning the fragile pages incredibly gently, exactly the way Arthur had taught him to do. He did not have to shrink his personality here. He did not have to quickly apologize for taking up space in his own home. He was entirely, completely safe. If you are listening to this right now, and you have spent your entire life living quietly on the absolute fringe of your own family, always the one who gives, always the one who fixes the disasters, while the others just take and take until your soul is completely empty, this is my direct, urgent message to you. You were never invisible to them because you lacked inherent value or worth. You were invisible because they were entirely, tragically blinded by their own massive greed and endless vanity. They simply could not see anything they couldn't instantly exploit for their own financial or social gain. Setting a hard, permanent, unapologetic boundary with toxic family members is not an act of betrayal. It is a necessary, beautiful restoration of your own soul. You are finally, bravely digging yourself out from under the crushing, suffocating weight of broken people who only valued your silence and your endless usefulness. I realized as I watched my son read in the sunlight that while my parents happily sold a priceless historical collection just to build a fake, tacky theater, I had proudly, ruthlessly destroyed their theater to save my child's entire future. Let's pause for a moment. Thank you for staying with me this far, you're truly amazing. Please help me by liking the video and commenting the number 1 below so I know you've been here with me until this point. This not only helps more people discover this story, but also lets me know that my experiences mean something to someone. Your support is the greatest motivation for me to keep sharing the rest of this journey. Have you ever faced something similar with your own family? Have you ever had to walk away completely to protect yourself or your children from the people who were supposed to love you the most? Share your story in the comments below. We read them all, and your voice absolutely matters here. And don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next journey.